March 2nd, 1996. Culpepper County, Virginia. After leaving her home in Baltimore in order to drive to Charlottesville, 25-year-old Alicia Showalter Reynolds goes missing, and her abandoned car is found alongside U.S. Route 29. Eyewitnesses report having seen Alicia speaking with an unidentified man in a pickup truck, and it becomes apparent that he may have tricked Alicia into pulling over before abducting her. 2 months later, Alicia's body is discovered in a remote field, and while it is theorized that she fell prey to a killer known as the Route 29 Stalker, no one is ever charged with her murder. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and for our first cold case of 2025, we'll be exploring a crime that was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the 1996 murder of Alicia Showalter Reynolds. This is a highly requested case which I briefly discussed on a previous episode I did about another crime, but since I've never done an individual episode about Alicia's story, I thought now would be a good time to cover it. If you heard our special update episode that we released last week, you'll know that I discussed the 1996 murders of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans, which took place in Virginia's Shenandoah National Park and was previously covered by our podcast on episode number 169. The case was solved last year after DNA testing linked the crime to a deceased serial rapist named Walter Leo Jackson, but for years, the prime suspect was a man named Daryl David Rice. Well, even though Rice has now officially been cleared of any involvement in the Shenandoah murders, he did spend time in prison for attempting to abduct another woman, and he is still considered to be a potential suspect in the murder of Alicia Showalter Reynolds. Alicia originally went missing on a road trip from Baltimore, Maryland to Charlottesville, Virginia, and after her abandoned car was found alongside U.S. Route 29, her body would be discovered in a remote field 2 months later. In the weeks prior to Alicia's disappearance, a number of female motorists reported being harassed by a man driving a pickup truck who would yell that there was something wrong with her car in an attempt to get them to pull over. It seemed apparent that Alicia's killer used the same strategy in order to get her to pull over before he abducted and killed her, and this unidentified man would become known as the Route 29 Stalker. Over the years, a couple of different individuals, including Daryl David Rice, have been pushed forward as suspects, and there's even been speculation that the Route 29 Stalker may have been responsible for some other unsolved cold cases in the area. This included the Shenandoah murders, but now that it's been established that the crime was committed by an individual who was never on the radar as a suspect, I thought this would be an ideal time to take a fresh look at the Alicia Showalter Reynolds case. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 per month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has around 80 exclusive bonus episodes and archives which are not available on a regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the murder of Alicia Showalter Reynolds. Our story begins in 1996, and our central figure is 25-year-old Alicia Showalter Reynolds. Alicia was born in Harrisonburg, Virginia, to parents Harley and Sadie Showalter, and has a twin brother named Patrick, as well as a younger sister named Barbara. After attending Goshen College in Indiana to major in biology and chemistry, Alicia is now a fourth-year graduate student at Johns Hopkins University, working towards a PhD in pharmacology. She currently lives in Baltimore, Maryland with her husband, Mark Reynolds, whom she has been married to for 14 months, and Mark is studying dentistry at the University of Maryland. As part of her work at Johns Hopkins, Alicia is involved in a research project to develop a vaccine to combat schistosomiasis and parasitic infections in third world countries. In fact, Alicia and Mark are planning to eventually go to Africa to help administer the vaccine, while Mark serves as a dentist there. At 7:30 a.m. on March the 2nd, Alicia said goodbye to Mark and drove away from the residence in Baltimore in her white 1993 Mercury Tracer. She embarked on a 150-mile trip to Charlottesville, Virginia, as she was planning to meet her mother Sadie at the Charlottesville Fashion Square Mall in order to purchase wedding dresses, as Alicia's twin brother Patrick is planning to get married soon. Alicia and Sadie were scheduled to meet at the mall at 10:30 a.m., but Alicia never showed up, and after waiting for her daughter for nearly an hour, Sadie phoned Mark. He confirmed that Alicia had left, but since there was drizzle and fog that morning, Mark wondered if she might have been delayed by weather conditions. Sadie proceeded to continue waiting at the mall for a few more hours, but Alicia still did not show up. Since cell phones were nowhere near as common back then, Alicia did not own one, but Sadie did, and Alicia had even taken down her mother's cell number before she left on her trip. However, Alicia never tried to call it, so after several hours of no contact, Mark finally became concerned enough to contact the police. Well, at around 6 p.m. later that evening, a Virginia state trooper discovered Alicia's abandoned Mercury Tracer on the southbound shoulder of U.S. Route 29 in Culpepper County, just 2 miles south of the town of Culpepper. This spot was around 50 miles from Charlottesville, but there was no sign of Alicia anywhere, and a white paper napkin had been placed under the windshield wiper. At the time, leaving a napkin on the windshield was usually standard practice for motorists who had experienced car trouble and left the scene in order to get help, but a mechanical inspection of the tracer would find nothing wrong with it, so no one could figure out why Alicia felt the need to pull over in the first place. It would also turn out that very same day, Alicia's credit card was found on a sidewalk in Culpepper, and a black hooded parka she had been wearing was discovered in Madison County alongside Virginia State Route 626, about 15 miles south of where her car had been abandoned. After an official missing persons investigation was launched, police set up a roadblock in Culpepper County on Route 29 the following day in order to stop motorists and ask them if they had seen Alicia. Well, a couple of witnesses report that the previous morning they had recalled seeing Alicia standing outside her tracer at the spot where it was ultimately found. The vehicle's hood was up, and Alicia was talking to a white male inside a parked, dark-colored pickup truck, possibly a green Nissan. When Alicia's disappearance started garnering media coverage, law enforcement would be contacted by over 20 women who claimed that they had experienced unsettling encounters with a white man driving a similar-looking pickup truck. Most of these incidents seemed to take place while these women were driving on the same 20-mile stretch of Route 29 in Culpepper County, not far from where Alicia went missing. They claimed that this man would pull up next to them in his truck, honking his horn and flashing lights, before he yelled that there was something wrong with their vehicle, such as sparks coming out of the back, and that they needed to pull over. While many of the women just ignored him and drove on, a couple of them did pull over, and when the pickup truck did the same thing, the man would climb out and go underneath their car to perform an examination before informing them that they had mechanical problems. He would then offer them a ride to the nearest payphone, and there were at least 2 women who accepted his offer and were driven somewhere and dropped off without incident. But even though the man seemed to have a pleasant demeanor on the surface, some of the women said that he would get agitated if they rejected his offer for help. In fact, if they elected not to pull over and instead drove to the nearest exit or another destination to have someone else check their car, they would learn that there was nothing actually wrong with it. The first reported sighting of this man took place on February the 12th, meaning that there seemed to be an average of over one of these incidents per day in the weeks leading up to Alicia's disappearance. As a result, the man soon became known as the Route 29 Stalker. Well, it turned out that a terrifying incident involving a man in a pickup truck had taken place in Prince William County on the adjacent Virginia State Route 234. Shortly after midnight on February the 24th, a woman named Alicia Showalter was driving home from her job at the Manassas Mall when a pickup truck pulled up next to her and the driver yelled that there were sparks coming out of her car. When Alicia pulled over, the man offered her a ride to get help, but shortly after she climbed into his truck, she became uncomfortable. The man would start driving very slowly, claiming that he couldn't see because of the lights on the vehicles driving behind him, so he pulled over to the side of the road on no less than 3 occasions. Alicia eventually asked the man to pull over again so she could get out, and after he did so, he attempted to attack Alicia and threatened her with a screwdriver. He tried to force her head into his lap, but when Alicia put up a fight against him, he decided to push her out of the truck and started driving away. Since Alicia's foot was tangled in the seatbelt, she was dragged for a short distance before she came loose, causing her to break her ankle. Alicia did manage to get medical attention, but once again, it turned out there was nothing actually wrong with her car. Investigators theorized that all the previous incidents with the man were test runs until he managed to lure Alicia into his truck and decided to attack her. Since Alicia managed to get away from him, it was speculated that he attempted the same ruse with Alicia the following week. The incidents with the Route 29 Stalker just happened to come to a halt after Alicia went missing, leading to fear that he had managed to successfully lure Alicia into his truck before he harmed her. The women who encountered this man provided similar descriptions of him, claiming that he was between 35 to 40 years old and about 5'10" or 6 feet tall. He also had a medium build and reddish-brown hair, which he frequently brushed back with his left hand. At least 2 of the women said that the man introduced himself as Larry Breeden, but while there were several men by that name living in Virginia, they were all eventually questioned and ruled out, which meant that the suspect was likely using a pseudonym. Alicia remained a missing person for 2 months, but on May the 7th, her decomposed body was discovered in a makeshift grave in an isolated field alongside a dead-end road near the unincorporated community of Lignum. The spot was about 15 miles southeast from where Alicia's car had been abandoned and was often used for logging. In fact, the field had recently been cleared of trees, and Alicia was found after a witness noticed vultures circling her body. To this day, Alicia's exact cause of death has never been released publicly by law enforcement, but they have confirmed that she was the victim of a homicide and likely murdered on the same day she went missing. Since the field was so isolated and not easy to find, there was speculation that the killer may have been a local resident or someone with knowledge of the area. Tragically, Alicia's twin brother Patrick was just 3 days away from graduating from medical school and 1 month from his wedding when his sister's body was found. Johns Hopkins University awarded Alicia a posthumous doctorate and created the Alicia Showalter Reynolds Research Award in her memory to honor outstanding PhD students. Her family also went on to establish the Alicia Showalter Reynolds Scholarship at Goshen College, which is awarded to women who are hoping to go into the science fields. Alicia's story would be featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, which aired in November of 1996, and it showcased a composite sketch of the unidentified pickup driver who was believed to be responsible for her murder. In spite of this, the investigation remained at a standstill until 2 potential suspects popped up on the radar in 2002. One of them was 38-year-old Richard Abonitz, who had lived in Spotsylvania County, Virginia in 1996. By 2002, Abonitz had relocated to South Carolina, but on June the 24th of that year, he abducted a 15-year-old girl named Carl Robinson from her friend's yard in Greenville, took her to his apartment in Columbia, and proceeded to rape her before tying her to his bed. While Abonitz was sleeping, Carl was able to free herself and escape, but by the time she went to the police, Abonitz had managed to take off and flee the state. On June the 27th, Abonitz was spotted in Sarasota, Florida, and led police on a high-speed chase, but when he was cornered, he elected to take his own life by shooting himself in the head. Within months, DNA testing would posthumously link Evonitz to a pair of unsolved cold cases involving 3 victims in Spotsylvania County. One of them was 16-year-old Sophia Silva, who was abducted from outside her home on September 9, 1996, before her decomposed body was found in Birchwood Creek 1 month later. The other 2 victims were a pair of sisters, 15-year-old Kristen Lisk and 12-year-old Katie Lisk, who were both abducted from outside their home by Evonitz on May 1, 1997, before he proceeded to rape and strangle them to death and dump their bodies in the South Anna River. At the time Alicia went missing, Evonitz lived just over 30 miles away from the spot her car was abandoned. Following his suicide, a search of Evonitz's apartment in Columbia turned up a locked storage container which housed a note which appeared to have written directions to the remote location where Alicia's body was found. But other than that, there was no conclusive evidence that Evonitz was responsible for Alicia's murder. Well, it turned out that in April of 2002, just over 2 months before Evonitz's death, another potential suspect popped up on the radar when 34-year-old Daryl David Rice was indicted by a federal grand jury on 2 counts of murder and another high-profile case. Of course, I'm referring to the murders of 24-year-old Julie Williams and 26-year-old Lolly Winans, a lesbian couple who were found bound and gagged with their throats slashed at their campsite at Shenandoah National Park on June 1, 1996. Since the park was located only about 30 miles from where Alicia went missing, and the crimes took place less than 3 months apart, investigators had looked at possible connections between the 2 cases. Just over 1 year later, in July of 1997, Daryl David Rice would be arrested for attempting to abduct a Canadian tourist named Yvonne Malbasha, who had traveled to Shenandoah National Park on vacation and was riding her bicycle on the Lewis Mountain Access Road. Malbasha soon found herself being harassed by Rice, who was driving through the park in his pickup truck. Rice forced Malbasha off the road and knocked her off her bike before yelling sexually explicit language and throwing a water bottle at her. When Rice pulled over and tried to force Malbasha into his truck, she resisted by refusing to release her grip on her bike and used it to defend herself. She managed to fight Rice off and ran into the woods, where she hid behind a large fallen tree. Rice then drove his truck towards the tree a few times in an apparent attempt to run her over, but he ultimately gave up and fled the scene. Malbasha immediately sought help from a park ranger, who used his mobile phone to provide a description of the truck and the driver to law enforcement. Prior to the attack, Rice had removed his truck's license plates, but he reattached them and changed his shirt after he fled the scene. In spite of this, he was soon pulled over at one of the park exits, and a search of the truck would uncover plastic cable ties, nylon rope, maps of Culpepper and Central Virginia, and a tarp large enough to conceal a body. After Malbasha positively identified Rice as her attacker, he pled guilty to 1 count of attempted kidnapping and received a sentence of 135 months at the Federal Correctional Institution in Petersburg. Not surprisingly, Rice was looked at as a potential suspect in the murders of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans, as he was known for having a history of misogynistic behavior towards women. Rice lived in Columbia, Maryland, and less than 2 weeks before his attack on Malbasha, he had been fired from his job as a computer programmer after repeated incidents of physical and verbal assaults on his female coworkers. Shortly after his arrest, Rice even told the authorities that he liked preying upon women because, quote-unquote, they are more vulnerable than men. The authorities spent over 4 years gradually building a case against Rice for the Shenandoah murders until his indictment, but before he could go on trial, the case against him fell apart, as forensic testing excluded Rice as the source of some male DNA found on pieces of evidence from the crime scene. As a result, the murder charges against Rice were dismissed in February of 2004, though he would remain behind bars to continue serving his sentence on the attempted kidnapping conviction. Now, like I mentioned in the intro, more advanced DNA testing was performed on the evidence from the Shenandoah murders 2 decades later. In June of 2024, it was announced that the DNA wound up matching a convicted serial rapist named Walter Leo Jackson, who hailed from Ohio and was publicly named as the killer. Jackson had already passed away in 2018 while serving a 20-year prison sentence in Cuyahoga County, but these results finally proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Rice did not commit the Shenandoah murders. However, his attack on Yvonne Malbasha showed that Rice was capable of violence towards women, so he was looked at as a potential suspect in the murder of Alicia Showalter Reynolds. Even though the Route 29 stalker was described as being between 35 to 40 years old, and Rice was 26 at the time, he did have a resemblance to the composite sketch. He drove a dark-colored pickup truck at the time, and while he lived in Maryland, Rice often traveled to Culpepper County to stay with his father, who lived just over 3 miles away from the spot where Alicia's car was abandoned. Employment records also showed that Rice was not working on most of the dates when female motorists reported being harassed by a man driving a pickup truck. The Virginia State Police tracked down a number of the women who encountered the man in the pickup truck in the weeks prior to Alicia's disappearance, and they were asked to look at a photo lineup containing 6 pictures, one of which was Rice. 6 women picked Rice as the man they saw with varying degrees of certainty. 5 said that Rice resembled or was similar to the pickup truck driver, and 1 said she was certain the driver was not Rice. While there wasn't enough evidence to link Rice to Alicia's murder, one of the women who positively identified him as the pickup truck driver was Carmelita Shomo, who had been attacked and managed to escape from him on February the 24th, 1996. So in June of 2004, the Prince William County Office of the Commonwealth Attorney indicted Rice on charges of abduction with intent to defile, robbery, and malicious wounding, and if convicted on all counts at trial, Rice could have received a maximum of 3 life sentences. Now, in the years following Alicia's murder, most of the reporting stated that no DNA evidence belonging to an outside party was recovered from her remains. However, in March of 2005, it was reported that Rice's defense attorneys had filed a motion seeking DNA analysis on a pubic hair which was found in Alicia's shoes or one of her socks. They were not sure if the hair had ever been tested, but they either wanted a Prince William County Circuit Court judge to authorize DNA testing or force the Virginia Division of Forensic Science to turn over the results if testing had already taken place. The judge did order that all forensic evidence from the Route 29 stalker be turned over to the defense, but this is the last mention I've ever seen of this pubic hair, so I'm not sure if DNA testing was ever performed or what the results might have been. Rice's trial began in August of that year, and even though Carmelita Shomo took the stand and identified Rice as her attacker, the defense pointed out credibility issues with her testimony. They alleged that after Carmelita made her initial identification of Rice, she was later approached by a private investigator who showed her a photograph of Richard Evonitz. This caused Carmelita to become visibly shaken, and she identified Evonitz as her attacker. However, when she was later asked to sign an affidavit about this, Carmelita changed her mind again and went back to saying that her attacker was Rice. The defense also mentioned that during the original investigation back in 1996, Carmelita had been asked to look at a photo lineup, and she wound up identifying a man as her attacker. But it turned out this man was a Virginia state trooper whose picture had been inserted into the pile, so the defense believed that this demonstrated that Carmelita's memory was unreliable. When Carmelita finally identified Rice years later, his photo had already been plastered everywhere in the media because of his indictment in the Shenandoah murders, so the defense argued that this could have created confirmation bias for her. Since the prosecution's case relied almost entirely on Carmelita's identification, her testimony left them less confident that they could secure a conviction, so on the 3rd day of the trial, they decided to make a deal with the defense in which Rice could enter an Alford plea to the reduced charge of unlawful wounding. This would allow Rice to maintain his innocence while acknowledging that the prosecution still had enough evidence to convict him, so after he agreed to the deal and entered the plea, he received a 14-month sentence on the unlawful wounding charge. However, this sentence would run concurrently with Rice's sentence for the attempted kidnapping of Yvonne Malbasha, which meant that he would not have to serve any additional prison time. Rice wound up being released in August of 2007, and while he went back to prison a few times for parole violations, he was not implicated in any more violent attacks and pretty much led a very quiet and reclusive life. Over the course of the next 2 decades, Alicia's murder continued to remain in the spotlight, but there would not be any major developments in the investigation. However, in November of 2023, Alicia's twin brother Patrick and her sister Barbara both gave interviews in which they expressed their belief that the composite sketch of Alicia's alleged abductor bore a resemblance to Rex Heuermann, who had recently been charged with 3 murders in the Gilgo Beach serial killings. In case you're not familiar with that case, in 2010 and 2011, the remains of several young women, many of them sex workers, were found along the Ocean Parkway near the remote beach town of Gilgo in Suffolk County, New York. It was believed that they were all murdered by the same man, who became known as the Long Island serial killer, and in July of 2023, a 59-year-old architect named Rex Heuermann was arrested and charged with the murders of 3 of these victims. At the time of this recording, Heuermann is yet to go on trial, but he has since been charged with the murders of 4 additional women. Even though Heuermann has lived most of his life in Long Island, he did have ties to Virginia, as his mother relocated to the town of Palmyra in 1994, and Heuermann would supposedly travel there to see her. Since Palmyra is located nearly 50 miles southwest of Culpepper, Heuermann could have taken U.S. Route 29 to drive there, and he was 32 years old in 1996, the same approximate age as the pickup truck driver. Patrick and Barbara both shared their opinion that investigators should look at Heuermann as a potential suspect in Alicia's murder, but thus far, law enforcement has not publicly commented about this. In one final postscript to this story, on the evening of July the 12th, 2024, just 15 days after he was publicly exonerated as a suspect in the Shenandoah murders, Darrell David Rice was riding a bicycle down a rural highway in Chariton County, Missouri, when he was struck and killed by a car. Rice was 56 years old at the time of his death, and as far as I know, he has never officially been ruled out as a suspect in this case. Over the past 30 years, law enforcement has investigated over 10,000 leads, but the murder of Alicia Showalter Reynolds continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So I've always considered this to be one of the more disturbing cold cases ever featured on Unsolved Mysteries, as the whole scenario about a killer convincing a victim to pull over by falsely claiming there's something wrong with their car before they proceed to abduct and murder them feels like it belongs in a horror movie. Alicia Showalter Reynolds was a very intelligent person who probably would have gone on to do great things in the field of science had she not been murdered, so this only demonstrates that anyone could easily be taken in by a ruse like this. We still can't be certain if Alicia was abducted from the spot where she stopped on Route 29, or if she willingly climbed into the perpetrator's pickup truck before she was harmed at a later time, but either way, I'm guessing that the driver must have been pretty convincing. It also sounds like Alicia was a victim who was definitely in the wrong place at the wrong time, as it appears that the pickup truck driver attempted this ruse on around 20 women, and even went so far as to give some of them rides without harming them. And while some of these women said that the guy became angry and aggressive when they turned him down, others described him as being perfectly pleasant and not giving off any creepy vibes. I totally agree with the police's theory that the perpetrator went through several practice runs before he finally worked up the will to kill someone, and it's possible that if Carmelita Shomo had not managed to fight this guy off and escape, he would have murdered her instead and brought a halt to this ruse before Alicia became a victim. This whole scenario reminds me of one of my all-time favorite movies, a 1988 Dutch thriller called The Vanishing, which features a seemingly ordinary family man with no prior criminal history suddenly deciding to commit an abduction and murder for the sole purpose of finding out if he was capable of it. The movie shows him doing a lot of preparation and practice runs, and even making some failed attempts to lure women into his car, before he's finally successful at abducting an unlucky victim. Since it sounds like Alicia's killer followed the same formula, it's reasonable to assume that this was the first time he'd ever murdered anyone, though whether he went on to murder anyone else after this is still up for debate. All we know for certain is that all these incidents on Route 29 involving the man in the pickup truck came to a halt following Alicia's murder, so if he did go on to commit more crimes, it's reasonable to assume that he changed his MO. However, this is also one case where I find it quite surprising that it is still unsolved after 3 decades, as we have plenty of witnesses who saw or interacted with the alleged attacker, who became known as the Route 29 Stalker. Hell, some of them even spent time in his pickup truck and had direct face-to-face contact with the guy, yet he has never been positively identified. And for what I can tell, none of these witnesses were able to provide a license number for the truck. This whole story may be a case study on the unreliability of eyewitness identification, as even the woman who was abducted by the stalker and managed to escape from him seemed uncertain about who he was. Of course, for the past several months, I've been wanting to take a fresh look at this case ever since the 1996 murders of Julie Williams and Lolly Wyans from Shenandoah National Park were solved. After decades of people speculating that the best suspects were Daryl David Rice and Richard Abonitz, DNA testing finally linked the crime to Walter Leo Jackson, a suspect who was never on the radar. The same logic may apply to Alicia Showalter Reynolds' murder, because even though Rice and Abonitz have always been considered to be the best suspects, it would not surprise me in the least if it turned out Alicia was killed by someone we still have not even heard about. Of course, in a cruel twist of fate, Rice wound up being killed in an accident only 15 days after he was exonerated of any involvement in the Shenandoah murders, so the top 2 suspects in this case, Rice and Abonitz, are now deceased. Walter Leo Jackson is also deceased, but in the 6 months since he was named as the Shenandoah killer, investigators have not provided any comment on whether he's now being investigated as a possible suspect in Alicia's case. Jackson was a serial rapist who did numerous stints in prison, but he is yet to be linked to any additional murders, and most of his other known crimes took place in Ohio, which is where he lived. He was known for traveling to Virginia to hike in Shenandoah National Park, so perhaps the reason he decided to kill Julie Williams and Lolly Wyans was because he happened to come across them at the remote campsite and thought it would be an ideal spot to commit a double homicide since he hailed from another state and there was less chance of this crime being linked to him. The park is located only about 30 miles from the spot where Alicia went missing, but I've yet to hear anything to indicate that Jackson was in Virginia in February or March of 1996, and he would have been 48 years old at the time, which is older than the description provided of the Route 29 stalker. I have my doubts that Jackson is involved in this case, but I do hope that investigators are covering all their bases and double-checking to be certain. Of course, now that we know for certain that Daryl Rice was falsely accused of the Shenandoah murders, and it's never been conclusively established if he attacked Carmelita Shomo, it's possible he had nothing to do with Alicia's murder. But on the other hand, we know that Rice was most definitely guilty of attempting to abduct Yvonne Malbasha in 1997, and he may have wound up murdering her if he had succeeded. Even bad people can be falsely accused of crimes they did not commit, so I certainly won't rule out the possibility that Rice was the Route 29 stalker. The same logic applies to Richard Abonitz, because even though we know that he didn't commit the Shenandoah murders, he was living in Virginia in 1996 and killed at least 3 girls during that time period. Even though 3 decades have passed, there are still a number of details about this crime which have never been released publicly, as we still don't know Alicia's exact cause of death. But one thing which is still not entirely clear to me is if usable DNA evidence exists. In 2002, after Abonitz first popped up on the radar as a potential suspect, the authorities told the press that no DNA belonging to an outside party was recovered from Alicia's remains. But nearly 3 years later, when Rice was about to go on trial for the attack on Carmelita Shomo, his defense team filed a motion to request forensic evidence from Alicia's case because they wanted to perform DNA testing on a pubic hair which was supposedly found on her shoes or socks. Even though the motion was granted, I've been unable to find any information about whether or not this testing was performed, but I have to assume that if it matched or excluded Rice, we would have heard about it. It's possible that the testing was inconclusive, but I know that Rice's attorneys wanted to collect DNA from Alicia's husband, Mark Reynolds, for a comparison, as the hair also could have wound up on Alicia by a secondary transfer before she left her residence in Baltimore. All that being said, the reason the Shenandoah murders got solved is because new DNA testing was recently performed on the evidence with advanced technology that was not available 2 decades ago. If there is DNA in Alicia's case, perhaps new testing could yield better results, but since the investigation remains very secretive, I cannot be certain how much forensic evidence they do or do not have. So before we talk any further about the known suspects, we have to discuss some other crimes from the area. If you go to Wikipedia, they have an entire page titled Missing Persons Cases along U.S. Route 29 in Virginia, as an unusually high number of young women have gone missing or been murdered in what has been described as the Route 29 corridor between Manassas and Charlottesville. 5 of these cases took place between 2009 and 2014, with the victims being Morgan Harrington, Samantha Clark, Sage Smith, Alexis Murphy, and Hannah Graham. Now, the Harrington, Murphy, and Graham cases have all been solved and ended with an arrest and conviction, as a suspect named Jesse Matthew is responsible for the Harrington and Graham murders, while another suspect named Randy Taylor was convicted of killing Alexis Murphy. Given the amount of time that has passed, I have my doubts that any of these cases are connected to Alicia's murder, but the Wikipedia page on the Route 29 crimes also lists the Shenandoah murders, as well as another case involving a young woman from Virginia, which took place 6.5 months after Alicia went missing and is still unsolved to this day. The victim in question was 20-year-old Anne Carolyn McDaniel, who suffered from cerebral palsy and disappeared after leaving an assisted living group home in the town of Orange on September the 18th, 1996. She told her housemates that she had a date that night, but didn't share the date's name or any other details about who this person was. On September the 22nd, Anne's burned remains were discovered near an abandoned hunting cabin in a remote area of Culpepper County near Lignum, and the spot was only 10 miles away from where Alicia's body had been found. Anne's exact cause of death was ruled to be asphyxiation before the perpetrator set her body on fire. The medical examiner determined that Anne was likely killed on September the 21st, which meant that she may have been alive for up to 3 days after she originally went missing. Indeed, eyewitnesses reported seeing Anne at a 7-Eleven convenience store on Main Street in Orange on the evening of September the 20th. She was apparently asking for a ride and attempting to hitchhike, but if these sightings and the medical examiner's ruling were accurate, we still don't know where Anne was during the first few days she was missing. An unnamed volunteer at Anne's group home was looked at as a person of interest, as she allegedly referred to him as her boyfriend at one point. It's never been determined if Anne was planning to go out on a date with this guy on the night she disappeared, and no evidence has been found to link him to her murder. Otherwise, there is very little information available about Anne's case. Since the circumstances of how Alicia and Anne were killed seem quite different, there doesn't appear to be any connection between the 2 cases, but like I mentioned earlier, the publicity surrounding Alicia's murder could have compelled the perpetrator to change his MO if he wanted to kill again. On one hand, it's tempting to believe that Alicia's killer was not a local resident because a composite sketch of the man, as well as a description of his pickup truck, was widely circulated, so you'd think that if he lived in the area, someone would have identified him. But on the other hand, the locations where Alicia and Anne's bodies were discovered were described as being so remote that it seemed unlikely the killer would have found them unless they were familiar with the region. If trees hadn't been cleared from the field and vultures were spotted circling Alicia's body, then it's possible she never would have been found. It's also interesting that the man in the pickup truck supposedly told at least 2 of the women he interacted with that his name was Larry Breeden. It seems obvious that was a pseudonym, but he chose a name that wasn't particularly common, yet was still common enough that there were a number of other men living in Virginia named Larry Breeden who had to be investigated and ruled out as suspects. So did the killer choose this name because he was personally acquainted with one of the real Larry Breedens? Or perhaps he just picked the name at random out of a phone book or something, since he knew it might complicate the investigation. We know that Richard Abonitz was living in Spotsylvania County in 1996, only about 30 miles away from Culpepper County, so he may have been familiar with the area. And while Darrell Rice lived in Maryland, he made frequent visits to Culpepper to visit his father, and I'm not sure if it's ever been conclusively established if he was there on the date Alicia went missing. I have heard that Rice's father traveled down to Florida during the time period when the incidents with the Route 29 stalker were taking place, so if Rice was staying at his father's place alone, he may have thought this was an ideal opportunity to try this scheme. But before we explore this angle any further, we have to discuss the comments made last year by Alicia's two siblings, Patrick and Barbara, who have pointed out that Rex Heuermann has a resemblance to the composite sketch of the Route 29 stalker and should be investigated as a potential suspect. To recap, Heuermann is believed to be the Long Island serial killer, and at the time of this recording, he has been charged with the murders of 7 women. He has not yet gone on trial, and is technically innocent until proven guilty, but yeah, it does appear that he may be one of the worst serial killers of the modern era. Even though Heuermann was originally charged with a series of murders which took place in 2009 and 2010, he has since been indicted for the murder of 28-year-old Sandra Costilla, which took place in Long Island all the way back in November of 1993, and predates Alicia's murder by 2.5 years. Since Heuermann supposedly took trips to Virginia to visit his mother during that time period, I suppose it's not impossible that if he had already committed murder in his home state by that point, he might have felt compelled to go after a victim in a different state. While composite sketches are never 100% accurate, I do have to acknowledge that the sketch of the Route 29 stalker does resemble Heuermann, who would have been in that age range back in 1996. And since he had no prior criminal record before 2023, he never would have popped up on the radar as a suspect during the original investigation. However, it sounds like this Heuermann theory has only been pushed forward by Alicia's siblings, and law enforcement has never publicly commented on whether they believe he might be connected to this case. Indeed, it does seem like a long shot, since most of Heuermann's alleged victims were vulnerable sex workers, many of whom were never officially reported missing. That seems to clash with the MO of the Route 29 stalker, who made a public spectacle of himself by harassing random female motorists on a busy highway. And one piece of information which has never been confirmed or denied is if Heuermann would have been driving a pickup truck during the 1990s, though he was driving a Chevrolet Avalanche at the time of his arrest in 2023. But I still figured I would bring up this theory, and I think one of the main reasons that Patrick and Barbara felt the need to speak out about it was their own frustration at the perceived lack of progress in the investigation into Alicia's murder these past several years. Anyway, getting back to Abonitz and Rice, since they are now both deceased, and it's possible that there is no usable DNA evidence in Alicia's case, how could either of these men, or anyone else for that matter, be posthumously linked to the crime if they were the perpetrator? Well, even though Abonitz was most definitely a monster, and certainly would have had the opportunity to commit a crime like this, the issue is that all of his known victims were underage girls, so I'm not sure how much interest he would have had with targeting adult women like Alicia. In addition, the 3 girls that Abonitz murdered in Spotsylvania County were all just brazenly abducted from outside their houses, and he pretty much did the same thing when he abducted Carl Robinson from a friend's yard in South Carolina years later. Would he really go to the trouble of orchestrating an elaborate scheme in which he coerced female motorists into pulling over by pretending there was something wrong with her car? It sounds like the only reason Abonitz popped up as a potential suspect in Alicia's case is because following his death, the authorities found a note in his apartment which appeared to contain written directions to the location where Alicia's body was found. And for that reason, Abonitz has also been looked at as a potential suspect in Ann McDaniel's murder, since her body was found not too far from that spot, though once again, no evidence has ever been found to implicate him. It's admittedly weird that these directions would be in Abonitz's possession, particularly after he relocated from Virginia to South Carolina, but there is really nothing else to link Evonitz to Alicia's case. I would think that if Evonitz was the Route 29 stalker, more of the women he encountered would have been able to identify him, but there has always been controversy about whether or not he might have attempted to attack Carmelita Shomo. As you might recall, when Darrell Rice went on trial for that crime, the defense went out of their way to paint Evonitz as an alternate suspect. The story goes that Carmelita Shomo initially identified Rice as her attacker, changed her mind and identified Evonitz when a private investigator showed her a photograph of him, and then changed her mind a second time and identified Rice again. And that's pretty troubling, because it seems pretty obvious that whoever attacked Carmelita was the same person who went on to murder Alicia, yet she seemed unable to say with any certainty who this guy was. I don't place any blame on Carmelita at all, because she was the survivor of a terrible ordeal, and it sounds like she may have faced undue pressure from different sources to identify certain suspects. But there are numerous documented wrongful conviction cases in which innocent people went to prison because the survivor of a sexual assault misidentified their attacker, so human memory is fallible. The first time Carmelita was asked to look at a photo lineup back in 1996, she wound up mistakenly picking out the picture of a state trooper, and this is when her memory was fresh. Her identification of Rice did not take place until years after the fact, and that's after he had made the news for getting indicted for the Shenandoah murders, which may have caused some confirmation bias. Some of the other female motorists who had encounters with the Route 29 stalker identified Rice, but once again, this did not take place until after his face had been plastered throughout the media, so could this have influenced their perception? Rice's defense attorneys alleged that his trial for the attack on Carmelita was part of a vengeful witch hunt, since the authorities were frustrated that the charges against him for the Shenandoah murders had been dismissed. The issue is that the entire case against Rice was based almost entirely on Carmelita's testimony, and there wasn't much in the way of corroborating evidence. Even though the trial ultimately ended with an Alford plea, one of the jurors told the press that he would have had a hard time convicting Rice since the defense had done an effective job at generating reasonable doubt. Now, you could take Rice's decision to enter the Alford plea as a sign of guilt, but the fact of the matter is that he was already serving a 135-month prison sentence for his attack on Yvonne Malbasha. So receiving an additional 14-month sentence, which would run concurrently with that one and not affect his projected release date, was essentially no punishment whatsoever and accomplished nothing. Even if Rice was innocent, I can understand why he would accept that plea rather than risk being convicted by a jury and potentially receiving some life sentences. And I can also understand why the prosecution would agree to offer this plea, because it technically still counted as a victory for them. But it was still a very unsatisfying conclusion, as figuring out who was responsible for the attack on Carmelita Shomo has always been the key to figuring out who murdered Alicia Showalter Reynolds. After his exoneration for the Shenandoah murders last year, Rice's attorneys tried to paint him as this railroaded victim of a government vendetta, and while that is partially true, that still doesn't change the fact that he attempted to kidnap Yvonne Malbasha only a year and a half after Alicia's murder took place, and he could have potentially killed her if she did not fight him off, so he definitely was a dangerous offender. This is why I'm not going to completely rule out Rice as a suspect in this case, as he does resemble the composite sketch of the suspect. He drove a dark-colored pickup truck at that time, and his father lived just over 3 miles away from the spot where Alicia abandoned her car. But at the same time, both Rice and Richard Evonitz have been on the radar as suspects in this case for 2 decades, and with all the available evidence and eyewitnesses, you would think that if either one of these guys were the perpetrator, the authorities would have been able to pin the crime on them by now. I just have a hunch that if this crime is solved, it is going to turn out to be a very similar situation to Walter Leo Jackson and the Shenandoah murders, and the perpetrator is going to be someone we've never heard of before. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure if there is any available DNA evidence in this case, but I do hold out hope that more advanced forensic testing can be performed, which leads to a resolution, or perhaps the right person might come forward with information to help crack the case. So if you happen to have any information about the murder of Alicia Showalter Reynolds, please contact the Virginia State Police Culpepper Division at 1-800-572-2260. That's 1-800-572-2260. You can also contact the Virginia State Bureau of Criminal Investigation at 1-888-300-0156. That's 1-888-300-0156. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6.5 years, our Patreon page has released around 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released an episode about the death of Joyce Meyer Sommers, a woman who was found dead in a cemetery shortly before Christmas in 1996 and remained a Jane Doe for nearly 26 years before she was identified. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss a final appeal case from Unsolved Mysteries, the controversial 1979 conviction of Michael Scott Martin. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have 70 of these commentary tracks in archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Mariana Z, Kristen S, and Zhao Min F. Thank you all so much for your support. I'd also like to announce that just under 3 months from now, The Trail Went Cold will be appearing at a new event called Advocacy Con, which is taking place from March the 28th to the 30th at the Indianapolis Marriott East Hotel in Indianapolis, Indiana. It's being put together by fellow podcasters Eric from True Consequences and Melissa and Whitney from Navigating Advocacy, and is intended as a platform for the families of missing and murdered victims. We have a specialized promo code you can use to get a discount on tickets, so if you would like to attend, please visit their website at advocacycon.com and use code TRAIL10 to get 10% off. Once again, the website is advocacycon.com and the promo code is TRAIL10 for 10% off tickets. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week, and be sure to join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.